January 14th, 1678. Scotland. Temperature, minus 18 degrees Celsius. A woman named Isabelle Young has been standing in one position for 19 hours. An iron collar weighing 14 pounds encircles her neck, chained to the church wall behind her. She cannot sit, cannot lie down, cannot even lean without the metal cutting deeper into her frozen skin. Her bladder failed publicly 6 hours ago. The urine froze to her skirt almost immediately. Her neighbors, the same people she's known her entire life, walked past her to Sunday service this morning, stepping carefully around the expanding pool of frozen waste beneath her feet. Her crime? She argued that feeding starving children was more important than strict Sabbath observance. For those words, the church sentenced her to 24 hours chained outside in the middle of winter. When they finally removed the collar the next morning, Isabelle was still breathing, but 3 of her toes had turned black with frostbite. Within a week, those toes fell off. She lived another 42 years, and every single step for the rest of her life reminded her of the price she paid for having an opinion about compassion. But here's what should terrify you. Isabelle wasn't unusual. She wasn't even unlucky. She was one of an estimated 10,000 Scottish women who wore the jugs, the iron collar of shame, and you're about to discover why winter made this punishment a potential death sentence. Before we dive into the nightmare mechanics of the jugs, you need to understand something critical about Scottish winters during this period. We're talking about the Little Ice Age, roughly 1,500 to 1,850, when European temperatures plummeted to levels that would shock modern people. Average January temperatures in Scotland regularly dropped to minus 15 to minus 20 degrees Celsius. The Firth of Forth, which rarely freezes today, was solid enough for frost fairs where they roasted oxen on the ice. Scottish churches weren't heated. Let me repeat that because it's crucial. The stone churches where women were chained had no heat source whatsoever. Stone walls, stone floors, completely open to wind through gaps in medieval masonry. These buildings were actually colder inside than outside because stone holds cold and blocks any sun that might provide minimal warmth. When Kirk Sessions chained women to church walls in winter, they were essentially creating human experiments in how long a person could survive extreme cold while standing immobile. The jugs itself was deceptively simple but brutally effective. Imagine a hinged iron collar, 10 to 15 pounds of solid metal, just wide enough to close around a human neck but not comfortably. Never comfortably. The interior diameter was deliberately tight enough to press against the throat and collarbone with every breath. That collar attached to a chain, typically 2 to 4 feet long, connected to an iron ring embedded in the church wall or market cross. The positioning was calculated psychological warfare. The chain length prevented sitting or lying down, but was just long enough to allow standing. Victims couldn't lean back because the chain would yank them forward. Couldn't lean forward because the collar's weight pulled them backward. They existed in a constant state of physical tension, muscles screaming, balance precarious, while the iron conducted freezing cold directly into their neck and upper chest. Kirk Session records, preserved in the National Museum of Scotland, reveal the systematic nature of this torture. Between 1,500 and 1,800, 90% of people punished for scolding, flighting, verbal arguments, gossip, or having a loose tongue were women. 90%. When men argued in the street, church courts called it vigorous debate or passionate discussion and sent them home. When women did the exact same thing, it became a crime worthy of public torture. Let me give you the actual documented statistics from Professor Louise Yeoman's analysis of hundreds of Kirk Session records. 70% of scold charges involved women criticizing church leaders or civic officials. This wasn't about keeping peace or maintaining decorum. This was about terrorizing women into silence whenever their voices challenged male authority. The jugs was the enforcement mechanism that made the whole system work, because every woman who saw another woman collared understood the implicit message. Your voice exists at the pleasure of men in power, and that permission can be revoked at any moment. Now let's talk about what actually happens to a human body when you chain them outside in Scottish winter wearing an iron collar. Hour 1 begins with adrenaline and shock. The woman has just been publicly marched to the church or market cross, the collar locked around her neck in front of witnesses. Her body is flooded with stress hormones that temporarily mask some discomfort. But within 30 minutes, the cold begins its work. The iron collar is conducting heat away from her body at an alarming rate. Metal at minus 15 degrees touching skin is almost immediately painful. By hour 2, violent shivering sets in. This is the body's desperate attempt to generate heat through muscle contractions, but shivering while wearing a tight iron collar around your neck is excruciating. Every shiver yanks the collar against throat and collarbone, creating pressure points that will bruise, then abrade, then potentially break skin. The National Museum records describe rust stains on surviving collars. Those aren't just moisture stains. That's where blood from abraded skin mixed with metal oxidation. Hour 3 brings the first signs of actual hypothermia. Core body temperature begins dropping below 35 degrees Celsius. Mental confusion starts creeping in. This is when many victims made critical errors, like trying to remove clothing because hypothermia creates a paradoxical sensation of being overheated. Kirk Session records occasionally note finding women partially undressed, which they interpreted as demonic possession or madness, rather than recognizing it as a symptom of severe cold injury. Hours 4 through 6 mark the transition from torture to potential lethality. The woman's heart rate has slowed dramatically. Breathing becomes shallow and labored. Extremities, fingers, toes, nose, ears, have long since gone numb as the body restricts blood flow to preserve the core. This is when frostbite damage becomes permanent and irreversible. Ice crystals form inside cells, expanding and rupturing cell walls at the molecular level. Tissue doesn't just freeze, it dies. Isabelle Young lost 3 toes, but Kirk Session records mention other women who lost fingers, portions of ears, tips of noses. A 1,623 Edinburgh record describes a woman named Christian Laurie who spent 3 days in the jugs during December and lost portions of both hands to the frost sickness. 3 days. They removed her only for brief periods during church services, then chained her right back up. She survived, but was unable to work afterward because she no longer had functional hands. By hour 8, if the victim is still conscious, she's experiencing severe hypothermia. Core temperature below 30 degrees Celsius, muscle rigidity, barely detectable pulse, slurred or absent speech. At this point, survival without immediate warming intervention becomes questionable. And yet, Kirk Sessions routinely sentenced women to 12, 18, even 24-hour durations in winter. They knew the danger. The danger was the point. Let me read you the actual crimes from Kirk Session records, because the triviality of these offenses compared to the brutality of punishment should make your blood boil. Aberdeen, 1,611. Margaret Leslie. Offense: sharp words with her husband in the street. She argued with her spouse publicly. 6 hours in the jugs. When her husband argued with other men publicly, which he did frequently, nothing happened to him. Sterling, 1,590. Bessie Atkin. Crime: scolding the minister's wife about poor relief. Translation: Bessie criticized how the church was distributing charity to poor people. She thought they were being unfair. She said something. The church collared her. Edinburgh, 1,623. Christian Laurie, saying the merchant's wife bought cloth from traveling tinkers. This statement was true, by the way. The merchant's wife had indeed purchased fabric from traveling salesmen, but it embarrassed the wealthy family, so Christian spent 3 days in the jugs and lost her hands to frostbite. Glasgow, 1,634. 2 women got into an argument over access to the village well. Water access, a resource necessary for survival. Both women were collared simultaneously, facing each other, forced to stand in iron, staring at each other's humiliation for 8 hours. Perth, 1,605. A woman was collared for 2 hours because she laughed too loudly during market day. The male witness who reported her testified, and this is a direct quote from the record, that her laughter disturbed the peace and dignity of godly commerce. She laughed too loud while people were shopping. 2 hours in iron. Do you see the pattern emerging? These weren't crimes in any meaningful sense. These were exercises of basic human autonomy that threatened male control. Margaret argued with her husband, undermining his authority in public. Bessie challenged church officials about resource distribution. Christian embarrassed wealthy families by telling truths they wanted hidden. The two Glasgow women fought over water, a resource men controlled access to, and the Perth woman's crime? She expressed joy audibly in a public space where men had declared women should be decorously quiet. The jugs enforced a social order where women's voices, women's opinions, women's very laughter existed only with male permission, and winter amplified the enforcement mechanism exponentially.